On the day my daughter's husband put his hand on my arm and told me I needed to think about what was best for the family, I had already been thinking about it for 4 weeks. He just didn't know what that thinking had produced. He was about to find out. My name is Raymond Holt. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years building a landscaping and property management company in Charlotte, North Carolina, with a man I considered my closest friend in this world, a man named Gerald Pruitt. And for 11 of those years, my wife Carol was married to me. I need you to stay with me on this one, friends, because this story goes somewhere most people don't see coming. Settle in, drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed, because I promise you, you are going to want to be here for all of it. It started with a receipt, not snooping, not suspicion, a receipt. I had been out in Gastonia for 3 days overseeing the installation of a commercial irrigation system for a shopping complex we'd taken on, and I came home on a Thursday afternoon to find a crumpled piece of paper on the kitchen counter next to the fruit bowl. Carol must have emptied her jacket pocket when she got home from wherever she'd been, the way you do without thinking. The receipt was from the Dunhill Hotel downtown. One night, room 412, a bottle of wine from room service. January 14th. I had been in Gastonia. I stood in my own kitchen holding that piece of paper for a long time. The kitchen smelled like the pot roast Carol had put in the slow cooker that morning before she left for work. The clock above the stove read 4:47 in the afternoon. The house was completely quiet. I set the receipt face down next to the fruit bowl exactly where I'd found it. I washed my hands. I sat at the kitchen table. And I started thinking. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment because I think most people assume a man of my age, a man who has been through what I've been through, would react with immediate certainty. But certainty is not what I felt sitting at that kitchen table on a January Thursday. What I felt was a specific kind of exhaustion. Not surprise. Exhaustion. Because somewhere beneath the surface of 11 years of marriage, a part of me had been carrying a low, quiet weight for longer than I'd allowed myself to acknowledge. This was not a revelation. This was a confirmation. And those are two entirely different things. Carol came home at 6:15. She looked at the counter when she walked in. The receipt was still there, face down. She picked it up without looking at me and put it in her purse. Then she kissed my cheek and asked how Gastonia went. I told her it went fine. She served the pot roast. We ate. We watched the news. She fell asleep on the couch before 9 o'clock, and I sat across from her in the armchair, watching the television I wasn't actually watching, and I made a decision. I was not going to react. Not yet. Not until I understood the full picture. Not until I had everything I needed. Because I had spent 31 years building something in this city, and I was not going to burn it down on a receipt and an instinct. I was going to be methodical. I was going to be patient. And I was going to know the truth before I moved a single inch. That night, after Carol went up to bed, I drove to the 24-hour diner on South Tryon. I ordered coffee, I didn't drink, and I sat in a booth by the window, and I thought. Gerald Pruitt had been my business partner since 1993. We met at a job site. I was 22 and working for someone else. So was he. 2 years later, we started Holt and Pruitt Grounds Management with a used truck, 2 mowers, and a handshake agreement that we'd split everything down the middle and never let money come between us. By the time I met Carol at a mutual friend's birthday party in 2013, Holt and Pruitt had 17 full-time employees, a fleet of vehicles, and 3 major commercial contracts in Mecklenburg County. I was 51 and I had never been married. Carol was 44 and had been divorced once. We dated for 2 years. Got married in the backyard of my house in Myers Park in front of 60 people. Gerald was my best man. He cried during the toast. Actually stood there and cried into the microphone and said he'd never seen me look at anything the way I looked at Carol. That man. That specific man. I sat at that diner booth until 2 in the morning. Then I drove home and I went to bed next to my wife, and I said nothing. The next 4 weeks were the quietest weeks of my life. On the outside, nothing changed. I came home when I said I would. I ate dinner. I asked about her day. I slept on my side of the bed. Carol moved through the house the same as always, unhurried, comfortable, completely at ease. She had no idea that the man sitting across from her at breakfast was working through a problem the same way he would work through any problem in the business. Systematically, without emotion getting ahead of logic. I want to tell you what I was doing during those 4 weeks. Because people imagine a betrayed man spending his nights crying or drinking or falling apart. That is not what happened. 3 days after the receipt, I called a woman named Patricia Morse. Patricia is a family law attorney in Charlotte who has been practicing for 28 years and has the particular energy of someone who was born without the capacity for shock. I had gotten her name from a client of mine, a man who'd been through his own version of something similar and had come out the other side intact. I sat across from Patricia in her office on East Moorhead Street. I told her everything I knew. She didn't reach for a tissue box. She reached for a yellow notepad. She asked me 4 questions. How long have you been married? 11 years. Do you have children together? No. Is the business structured as a partnership? Yes. Does your partnership agreement have a written conduct clause? I told her I wasn't sure. She looked up over her reading glasses. Find out before our next meeting. I liked her immediately. Now here is where the story turns into something most people wouldn't expect. Because what I found when I went back through our partnership agreement with the help of our original business attorney, a meticulous man named Howard Finch, who had drafted the document in 1995 and updated it twice since, changed the entire shape of what came next. Howard sat across from me in his office and read through the relevant sections while I waited. He took his glasses off when he finished. Raymond, he said, Section 11, Conflict of Interest and Conduct. Either partner found to have engaged in conduct that constitutes a deliberate conflict of interest, including but not limited to unauthorized use of company resources, deception that materially affects the partnership, or actions that damage the professional reputation or financial standing of the company, shall be subject to mandatory buyout at a rate determined by an independent valuation. The non-offending partner retains right of first refusal on all active contracts. Howard put his glasses back on. When did you find the receipt? January 14th. He wrote something down on his notepad. Start pulling expense reports, he said. I'd had the same thought. I spent 2 weeks going through 4 years of expense reports with the focused attention of a man who keeps his own books. I had always managed the finances in the partnership. Gerald handled operations and client relationships. I handled money, which meant I knew every line. And when you know every line, anomalies stand out the way a weed stands out in a clean lawn. I found them. Hotel charges under client consultation. 11 of them over 14 months. None enormous. Amounts that could have been explained as overnight stays for a job in another county. Except when I pulled the project calendar. There were no jobs on those dates in any county that required an overnight. Every single charge fell on a weekend or a personal day Gerald had taken. I printed each one. I put them in a folder. I labeled it Quarterly Reconciliation Audit because that is what the folder was, technically. And because the title I actually wanted to use was not something I needed sitting in my filing cabinet. 11 documented instances. All on company funds. All mine now. I won't tell you those 4 weeks were easy. They were not. There were nights when I sat out on the back porch of that house in the cold, just me and the dark and the sound of the neighborhood settling, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I was carrying. 11 years of mornings. 11 years of her reading the paper at the kitchen table in her bathrobe. 11 years of Carol coming to job site events and charming every client I'd ever had. 31 years of Gerald. 31 years of solving problems together, of fighting over contracts and always finding our way back to what we'd built, both of them gone the same moment. That kind of loss does not have a clean name. You feel it in the chest, in the silence after you turn the lights off. I gave myself whatever time I needed on that porch. Then I went back inside, because I had work to do. March 3rd. A Tuesday evening. Carol was watching something in the living room. I was in the kitchen. She came in around 8 o'clock and turned the faucet on to fill a glass of water, and then she just stood there with her back to me. I waited. She turned around. I need to tell you something, Raymond. Yes, I thought. I know you do. The calendar has caught up with you. I set down what I was doing. I looked at her. She told me about Gerald. She said it had started a little over a year ago. She said she hadn't meant for it to happen. She said she'd tried to end it twice and hadn't been able to. She was crying before she finished the first sentence, which told me she had scripted this conversation carefully and had cast herself as the repentant one and expected me to play the stunned and devastated husband. I watched her talk. I did not interrupt. When she finished, there was a long silence. She was waiting for something, an explosion, a collapse, something she could react to. How long did you know? I asked. About what? That this was going to be something you had to tell me. She looked at her hands. A long time. I nodded. I need a few days to think, I said. She said my name. Carol. I'm not raising my voice. I'm not going anywhere tonight. I just need a few days. She cried harder. The way people cry when their plan isn't going the way they rehearsed it. I got up and went to the back porch. I gave myself 15 minutes. 5 days later, her daughter from her first marriage came to the house. Her name is Renee, 38 years old, sharp, opinionated, and fully convinced that she has a gift for resolving conflict that has never actually been tested in any situation that mattered. She arrived with her husband Daniel, who has the particular talent of adopting whatever position requires the least personal courage in any given room. They sat down in my living room like they owned the square footage. Renee folded her hands on her knees and tilted her head the way people do when they've practiced being compassionate. Raymond, nobody is saying what my mother did was okay. Daniel nodded as though he had written that line. But she is my mother, and she is hurting, and she is asking for a chance to make this right. And I think you're a big enough person to at least consider that. I looked at her, then at Daniel, who was looking at a spot on the wall just past my shoulder. I think this is an incredibly painful situation for everyone, I said, and I need a little more time to understand what I want to do. Renee exhaled, relieved. That is all we're asking, Raymond. Just don't make any permanent decisions while you're in the middle of the pain. She said this last part the way people say things they found on the internet and have been saving for a moment that felt important enough. Daniel nodded again. Then her brother Marcus arrived. He hadn't been invited. He let himself in through the side door because he had a key Carol had given him years ago and had apparently never considered giving back. He came into the living room, took one look at the arrangement of people on the furniture, and decided the temperature of the room needed to be raised. Marcus is 51. He coaches high school football in Concord and has operated his entire adult life on the assumption that volume is a substitute for reasoning. He pointed at me. Raymond. He said my name like it was a verdict. You're not the first man this has happened to, and you won't be the last. But I promise you, the men who walk away from their marriages when things get hard are not the men anyone remembers well. That's not what you want your legacy to be. He said legacy the way coaches say it when they want a teenager to run into a wall for them. I looked at Marcus for a moment. He was standing next to the bookshelf. He'd helped himself to the bowl of mixed nuts I kept on the side table. He was eating them with the complete comfort of someone who had decided he belonged wherever he was. I watched him eat my cashews, and I thought, you are going to remember this afternoon for a long time, Marcus. Just not for the reason you think. I said, you're right, Marcus. I need to think very carefully about the kind of man I want to be and what I want to leave behind. He pointed at me again, this time with a cashew between his fingers. That is exactly right. That is the right way to think about it. He ate the cashew. Renee looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the wall. What none of them knew, sitting in my living room on that Tuesday afternoon, eating my cashews and practicing their compassion in my direction, was that Patricia Morse had already filed the divorce petition, that Howard Finch had already sent Gerald the formal partnership dissolution notice under Section 11, citing 11 documented instances of misuse of company assets during personal conduct that constituted a direct conflict of interest, that the independent business valuation had already been commissioned, that the 3 largest commercial contracts in our portfolio, contracts I had personally secured and maintained across 17 years of relationship building, were already in conversation with my new entity, Holt Property Group, a company registered in my name alone 2 weeks prior. What they did not know was that the man sitting across from them in his own living room, listening patiently and nodding and saying he needed more time, had already made every decision that mattered. He was simply waiting for the appropriate moment to let the truth fill the room. That moment, as it turned out, was not in the living room. I've always preferred a smaller audience for things that matter. I reached out to Renee first, asked if she'd be willing to meet me for coffee privately, just the two of us, before the divorce proceedings became a matter of public record. She said yes without hesitation. We met at a coffee shop in South End on a Thursday morning. I was there first. I had a folder on the table when she sat down. She looked at it, then at me, and smiled the slightly cautious smile of someone who thinks they're about to receive an apology. I slid the folder across to her. She opened it. She read in silence for about 3 minutes. She looked up. "What is this?" I turned a page for her and pointed to a date. "That's November of last year. Your mother told you she was visiting her college roommate in Raleigh for the weekend. You texted her Saturday morning asking if she'd gotten there safely. I remember because Carol mentioned it at dinner." Renee stared at the page. "She was in the Dunhill Hotel on South College Street, 2 blocks from where you work." Renee's jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. I turned to another page. "March of this year. Your mother borrowed Daniel's truck, said her car was making a noise." Renee looked up before I even pointed to anything on the page. Her eyes had gone a different color somehow. The charge on the company account that day was a restaurant in Ballantyne that Gerald listed under a client dinner. He doesn't have any clients in Ballantyne. I closed the folder and slid it back slowly. "I'm not showing you this to cause harm, Renee. I'm showing you this because you sat in my house and asked me to consider what I was leaving behind. I thought you deserved to know the full picture before you formed a strong opinion about what I should accept." She sat with both hands flat on the table for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee. She didn't say a word. Neither did I. I left enough money on the table to cover both drinks and I walked out. Marcus was a different kind of meeting. He chose the location, a sports bar in Concord, which felt very on brand. He came in already talking. "Look, I know you're hurting. I know this feels like the end of everything. But a man of your generation knows that marriage is not something you throw away when it gets inconvenient." I waited for him to finish. Then I put the folder on the table between us. "What's that?" "Information," I said. "You can do whatever you want with it." He opened it with the confidence of a man who expects to be unimpressed. He read. He got 4 pages in and stopped. He turned back a page. "Read it again." He put the folder down on the table and looked at a spot somewhere to my left. "You told me," I said, "that the men who walk away when things get hard are not the men anyone remembers well. I want you to read that folder and tell me, Marcus, who walked away from this family." He didn't respond. He closed the folder. He didn't look at me. I picked up my drink and finished it. "I don't need anything from you," I said. "I just needed you to know the whole story before you finished forming it." I got up. He was still staring at the table when I walked out. Daniel got a text message. Because I was not scheduling a third meeting for a man who spent his entire time at my house looking at the wall. I kept the text brief and factual. He responded 12 minutes later with, "Okay, I understand." The most words he'd contributed to any interaction we'd had in 6 years. After that, I stepped back and let the truth do what it has always done when it is finally allowed into a room full of people who have been working with an incomplete version of it. Within 3 weeks, Carol had stopped calling me and started calling Renee. Repeatedly, desperately, from what I could gather. The story she had maintained for 14 months was meeting people who now had receipts she couldn't explain and dates she couldn't account for, and a version of events that did not match the one she'd been telling them. Gerald had already retained his own attorney. The partnership dissolution had moved into formal proceedings. He called me twice. I let it go to voicemail both times. The third time he sent a text. "Raymond, come on. Don't do this to 30 years over something we can fix. Something we can fix." I read that text twice, put my phone in my pocket, went back to what I was doing. Some responses are a waste of the breath it takes to form them. I never replied. Under the terms of the dissolution, I walked away with primary rights to the 3 major commercial contracts, representing just under 65% of annual revenue. I retained 4 of our best crew leads, men who had worked with me personally for over a decade and who called me within a week of the formal notice. I got the equipment that was purchased under my personal guarantee. I kept the office lease on Independence Boulevard. Gerald got the company name, the logo, and a client list composed largely of smaller residential accounts and 2 commercial clients whose primary relationship had always been with him. I want to be honest about something. I did not enjoy any of this the way people imagine you enjoy revenge. There was no satisfaction in watching something I'd built for 31 years get divided on paper. It was surgical, and it was necessary, and it was the right thing, but it was also a loss. And I am old enough to know the difference between a loss that is also a liberation and one that is simply a loss. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in October. Patricia sent me a brief email. Raymond, done. File attached. You were a model client. Organized, thorough, no surprises. I called her. Thank you, Patricia. I mean that. She said, go live, Raymond. That is the entire point. She hung up before I could respond. I held the phone for a second after she did. Then I smiled, because that was the first time I had ever heard Patricia Morse be anything other than professionally composed, and it turned out she had something in her that was warmer than I'd expected. I had moved into a house in Plaza Midwood 4 months earlier, smaller than the house in Myers Park, a front porch, a yard I actually wanted to tend to, a kitchen that got good light in the mornings. I set up Holt Property Group in a 2-room office space on Central Avenue, just me and my office manager Connie, who had worked with me for 9 years, and had told me without any additional commentary that she was coming with me when I left. She showed up on the first day with her own coffee maker and a plant for the windowsill, and never mentioned the circumstances that had brought us there. I was grateful for that. Renee called me on a Saturday afternoon in November. I was on the porch reading. I almost didn't answer. Raymond. Hey, Renee. She was quiet for a moment. She wasn't preparing to perform anything. She was just quiet the way people get quiet when something they thought was solid has turned out not to be. I'm sorry for what I said in your living room, that you needed to consider your legacy. I should have known you better than that before I said anything at all. I told her she didn't have anything to apologize for. She said she did. We disagreed about it briefly and then let it go, because that is what reasonable people do. She asked how the business was going. I told her we'd signed a new contract last week, a hospital complex on the east side. She said she was glad. How is your mother? I asked. Not because I needed to know, but because Renee was still her daughter, and that was a real thing, regardless of everything else. She exhaled slowly. Complicated, she said. I told her I understood that. We talked for a few more minutes, nothing heavy. She asked about my yard. I told her about the Japanese maple I'd put in along the side fence. She said her grandmother had one of those when she was growing up. Before we hung up, she said, you handled all of this with more dignity than any of us deserved. I told her I'd just been trying to be honest. She said sometimes that's the same thing. Maybe she was right about that. Gerald and Carol are together now, as far as I can tell. I know this, the way you know things in a city where you've lived for 40 years, through contractors who work for both of us, and clients who still call me first, and neighbors who mention things without meaning to. From what I can gather, the version of themselves they built inside the secrecy is a more complicated thing now that the secrecy is gone. I don't track it. I don't need to. I have better things to do with my mornings than wonder about the life they built on what they took from me. What I can tell you is this. The week I opened the Holt Property Group office, I was 63 years old and I had no business partner, no wife, and a company I was building from scratch for the second time in my life. By the end of the first quarter, I had signed 4 commercial contracts. By the end of the second, I had 8 employees and a waiting list. One of those employees, a young project manager named Andre who had reached out through a referral, told me in his second week that he'd heard I was the kind of person who answered his own phone and remembered what he'd promised. I told him that wasn't a particularly high bar. He said in this industry, apparently it was. I thought about that for a while after he left the office. Sometimes the standards we take for granted are the ones that actually matter. I want to be honest about what I take from all of this. Renee's family walked into my house and told me to think about my legacy. They weren't entirely wrong. But a legacy is not what other people decide you should leave. A legacy is what you build when you have every reason to burn things down and you choose to build anyway. It is what you do in the 4 weeks when no one is watching. It is the folder you organize and the attorney you call and the 15 minutes you give yourself on the back porch before you go back inside. It is the Japanese maple you put in along the side fence of a house that is smaller than the one you left but is entirely, completely, without question your own. Marcus told me the men who walk away when things get hard are not the men anyone remembers well. I walked away from a marriage that had been a lie and a partnership that had been a fraud. And the only thing I intend to leave behind is a company with my name on the door and a yard I am genuinely proud of. If those two things are my legacy, I'll take them. I'll take them without hesitation. If this story hit something for you, friends, hit that like button and subscribe. I'll see you on the next one.